UK. Inheritance tax 1 year on. Still not sure how this affects your estate? Here's what you need to know. If you have any connection to the UK, I'm talking you live there, you own a flat there, or maybe you're just thinking about moving, then this is something you absolutely need to understand. And let me be clear about this. This isn't some small adjustment or a minor tweak. The government has basically torn up the old rulebook and thrown it out the window. What we're looking at here is a complete and total reset of the system. But before we dive into all the things that are changing, let's talk about the one big thing that isn't. The UK's inheritance tax rate is still a whopping 40% on assets above the tax-free limit. So the potential bill hasn't gotten any smaller. But how you end up on the hook for it has been completely rewritten. So let's get to the heart of this reform. The old system was all based on this kind of fuzzy, complicated concept called domicile. It was tied to your family origins and your long-term intentions, subjective and often hard to prove. Well, that's out. What's in? A simple objective test based on residency. Just think of it like a stopwatch that starts ticking the second you move to the UK. And this brings us to probably the single most important new concept you've got to get your head around. Are you considered a long-term resident, or LTR for short? The definition itself is actually simple. You become an LTR once you've been a resident in the UK for at least 10 of the last 20 tax years. That's it. The day you arrive in the UK, that stopwatch starts. Once you've been there for 10 years, boom, you get LTR status. From that moment on, your entire worldwide estate, we're talking about that vacation home in Spain, your US bank accounts, everything, it's all potentially subject to that 40% UK inheritance tax. Well, this clock can also work in your favour. If you leave the UK, you can eventually lose that LTR status and shield your global assets from UK tax. The catch? It takes 10 consecutive years of being a non-resident to do it. So we know who might have to pay based on how long they've been in the country. The next obvious question is, what assets are actually being taxed? Let's break that down. It really boils down to two simple golden rules. Rule number 1. If an asset is physically located in the UK, it's always in scope for inheritance tax. It doesn't matter where you live or what your status is. And rule number 2, for any assets you have outside the UK, they're only in scope if you are a long-term resident. Simple as that. Okay, now let's focus on a really critical risk area. This is a big one that a lot of international families are going to run into with these new rules. I'm talking about transfers between spouses. The rule in the UK is generous. You can pass your entire estate to your spouse and it's completely free of inheritance tax. We're talking a 100% exemption. What happens if the person you're leaving your assets to hasn't lived in the UK long enough to be considered a long-term resident? Well, that's where the rules change completely, and it can get really painful. If you pass assets to a spouse who is an LTR, that exemption is unlimited. They get everything tax-free. But if your spouse is a non-LTR, that unlimited exemption just vanishes. It gets replaced by a very strict cap of only £325,000. Any value transferred above that tiny cap is immediately hit with a full 40% tax rate. What does this mean for you, and what can you do about it? Well, it really depends on your situation. If you're a long-term expat who's been out of the UK for over a decade, it's time for a review. Your non-UK assets might now be safely out of the tax net. If you're thinking about moving to the UK, timing is everything. Structuring your assets before you arrive could offer you some serious long-term protection. UK property. There are strategies to explore, like using a mortgage to reduce its taxable value. At the end of the day, it all boils down to this. This is a complete reset of the UK's inheritance tax system. And what that means is for anyone with ties to the UK and assets in other countries, sitting back and doing nothing is just not an option anymore. Proactive planning has become essential. Do note that this is general information about UK inheritance tax. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, and outcomes can vary significantly depending on your specific circumstances. For example, what happens if you and your spouse have been living outside the United Kingdom for more than 10 consecutive years? In this case, you may have lost your long-term resident LTR status. If an unfortunate event occurs, such as the death of a spouse, the surviving spouse will still inherit the assets. That does not change. However, the tax treatment of those assets may be very different. This is where things can become complex, particularly for international families with assets across multiple jurisdictions. The key takeaway is simple. Assumptions can be costly, and proper structuring ahead of time is critical. This is where 𝙄𝙗 Worldwide Advisors come in, helping you navigate the rules and proactively plan your estate before costly mistakes happen. Contact your 𝙄𝙗 Worldwide Advisor today to review your position and ensure your estate is structured the right way.